Chapter 1. Abigail Lund wanted to cry when she heard they were stopping for the evening. Most of the women on the trail were exhausted and ready to stop. And she was ready as well, but she knew her father would be in a horrible mood. He had been since her mother passed the month before. And one of their last 4 oxen had died earlier that day. Surely, he would find a way to blame it on Abby. He always did. As the men parked the wagons for the night, Abby immediately went to start a fire. It had been a long hard day that had begun with the frightening descent of Big Hill. Fortunately, no one had been killed in the descent and only one person had been injured, so they were all counting that as a win. She wished they'd been lucky enough to have a doctor along with them, but that hadn't happened. When she'd broken her arm early in the journey, it hadn't been set quite right, and it still pained her. She was just thankful it was an arm and not a leg. She began cooking their meal, having gotten a roast from her friend Anna, whose husband had shot a buffalo the day before. Oh, they typically always shared meat with everyone, but sometimes when it was scarce, only close friends got some of the bounty. She chopped the meat into tiny pieces and put it into the pot, covering it with water, while she peeled carrots and potatoes, and then dropped them in as well. Hopefully, the meal would please her father and put him in a better mood for a change. He joined her just as she was sitting back after putting everything on to cook. "When do we eat?" he asked, his voice gruff. "It should take an hour or so," Abby said, not meeting his gaze. He always seemed angrier when she looked at him. "We lost another ox today," he said. "That leaves us with just 2. And there will be no one to give the oxen a break. It's too much for them to walk every day." "Is there no one who has extra we could buy?" she asked softly, praying he wouldn't be angered that she'd asked a question. "Where are we going to get the money for oxen, girl? Use your head. God didn't put it on your shoulders to hold your hat." Abby nodded slightly. "Sorry, Pa. We're supposed to be near the town of Clover Creek the next couple of nights. I may see if we have anything someone needs in trade." He eyed her for a moment as if thinking about what he could see. "I could trade you for 4 oxen. I don't know that you're worth that much, but if you keep your mouth shut while we're there, I bet I could find someone to take you." She didn't argue with him. It wouldn't be any use. Besides, she needed to be away from him. Perhaps being traded for oxen would be just what she needed to get away from his anger. "All right, Pa." He laughed, a good belly laugh. "I figured you'd agree. Your ma would never have agreed to it, but she was certain you were a good daughter who would do anything for her parents." "I'm not so sure." He kicked her with the toe of his boot. "Just get supper done, and I'll see if anyone in the company will trade some oxen for you. If not, we'll find someone at the next settlement." She rubbed her bottom where he'd kicked her as he walked away. They were parked beside Anna and her husband, and Anna hurried over. "Are you all right? I saw him kick you." Abigail shrugged. "It's not the hardest he's kicked me, nor the first time. Hopefully, it will be the last." "What do you mean?" Anna asked. She and Abigail had been friends before Anna married, and they set out on the trail. "Just that he's trying to find someone to trade 4 oxen for me. He said if no one in the company will do it, he'll sell me to someone in the next settlement we reach, Clover Creek. We'll be there tomorrow." Abigail kept her voice light as if being sold to a stranger for cows was something that happened every day. "Oh, Abby, I wish I knew what to say. I don't want to see you sold to a stranger, and there aren't many young unmarried men looking for wives in our company." "There's old Mr. Schuster," Abby said, but she knew she would never be able to marry the old man. His wife had died at the beginning of their journey, and she'd been 40 years younger than him. She was raising her children and his previous wife's children. Now he had to deal with the children on his own. Several times he'd tried to approach her and ask her to step out with him, but she'd always said no. Thankfully, she didn't think he had enough oxen to spare. You are not marrying him. Anna hissed at her. You're not marrying anyone like him either. I refuse to lose my best friend to marriage to an old man. I don't know that I have a lot of choice in the matter, Abby said. Her mother had always let her make her own decisions, but her father had never done so. He'd been mean to her mother, but she'd never seen him raise his hand to her. He had always looked at Abby as a wasted piece of human flesh to pound on and kick. Oh, Abby. I can't lose you. Abby nodded, a tear slowly descending her face. If I marry someone in the town we're about to reach, then I'll just have to write to you. Anna nodded, tears filling her eyes. And I'll write you back. I know you will. If I stay, we'll talk Stephen into coming back here to live. I'm sure there's still land around. Look at that vast prairie. And if we're only a day's walk from Clover Creek now, we'll be close enough to take a horse even if we live here. And your father won't be able to stop us. Abby smiled. Has he ever? Anna giggled, thinking of some of the mischief she and Abby had gotten up to over the years of their friendship. They'd only fought once, and that was because Abby had a crush on Stephen, but he'd only ever had eyes for Anna. Abby had forgotten her crush on her friend's husband a few years before, and now they were as thick as thieves. At 19, they were old enough to go to Oregon and claim their own territory, but it didn't seem as if Abby would make it all the way to Oregon. Supper was ready when her father returned. Only man who'll have you is Old Man Schuster, but he only has one spare ox, and he needs that one to make it to Oregon. Hopefully, we'll be able to trade you in Clover Creek. He took the bowl Abby handed him and said a long prayer over the meal. He was proud of what a good Christian he was and took every opportunity to show it. After the meal, he wandered off again. He only spent time with her if he needed something from her, so Abby mostly felt she was on the trail by herself. Well, with Anna and Stephen really. When her mother had been alive it was different, but now, without her mother, she was really and truly alone. Abby scrubbed the dishes clean and put all of their cooking utensils into the wagon. Her father hadn't said a single thing about the stew. At least with her mother, he'd always grunted that the food was good. With her, it was as if he was afraid if he complimented her, she'd want to stay with him. They only had half a day's walk to Clover Creek the following day, and they camped in a large area at the base of a huge hill. Many of the women had gone to the store in the small town to shop, but Abby knew they didn't have the money to waste on frivolities like fresh bacon when there were plenty of beans left for them to eat. She was in the process of starting her cook fire for the night when her pa walked up behind her with a young man beside him. Abby, this is Bastian. What an odd name, she said, nervous, because she was sure this man was trading 4 oxen for her. He nodded. It's Sebastian, but my younger sister started calling me Bastian as soon as she could talk, so now I'm Bastian. I like that. Are you close to your sister? She asked. Her pa drew his foot back, but then seemed to think better of it. You need to hush while we men work some details out. Abby nodded, not much caring what was said at that moment. She was just happy she'd not been kicked. The men walked away and talked for a few minutes, but when Pa came back, he looked positively gleeful. He's trading 6 oxen for you. I told him that he was overvaluing you, but he insisted. I see. Not that she was at all surprised. She'd expected it. Should I stay here and fix supper for you, or do you want me to leave now? Pa seemed to think about it for a minute, but he finally said, I'll walk with the 2 of you to the church. I'm not going to trade you to be a whore. He said he'd marry you. Abby wasn't surprised by his words, but Bastian gasped. You can't call her a whore. Pa looked confused about why the other man was upset. Oh, I didn't. I said she'd be a wife, not a whore. Abby didn't say anything, but she stood and gathered the belongings that were hers and not the family's. She had 2 dresses, a journal her ma had given her, and her mother's necklace. Nothing else. She refused to feel ashamed about how little she had. I have to tell my friend Anna. Bastian nodded, understanding women's friendships were different than men's. Go. Abby ran to Anna's wagon and quickly explained she was marrying a man named Bastian. I'll miss you. And I'll nag Stephen every day until he agrees for us to settle here. Abby laughed softly as she hugged her friend goodbye. I sure do hope we'll see you soon. And with those words, she ran back to walk a few steps behind her father and Bastian to the church. Bastian kept looking over his shoulder at her, as if he thought she should walk with him, but she seemed to prefer her spot behind them. It was odd to him, but he also thought it was odd that he'd been able to buy her for 6 oxen. Thankfully Pa had married a year before, and he had a cabin of his own. It wasn't large, but it was big enough for 2. Eventually, they'd build him a house, but his married siblings came first. One of his brothers had just moved into a house of his own earlier that summer. Bastian called out when they arrived at the church, which was also the parsonage. Pastor Scott. Mrs. Scott. A young woman who couldn't have been more than a year or 2 older than Abby walked into the sanctuary. When she saw who was yelling, she smiled. How can I help you, Bastian? I'm here to get married. Is the pastor around anywhere? Yes, I'll go get him. He's just outside. Mrs. Scott hurried away, and came back with a man who was wearing work clothes, and had sweat streaming down his face. Sorry, I was out chopping up some wood for winter. Bastian nodded. It's not much fun, but it needs to happen. I'm here to marry Abigail. The pastor turned his gaze to Abby. You must be from the wagon train that just set up camp. Abby nodded, knowing better than to say much with her father there. He'd kick her if he felt she was speaking out of turn. If you don't mind my appearance and smell, we can do it right now. We don't mind, Bastian answered, talking for both of them. Pastor Scott looked at her father. You must be Abigail's father. Unfortunately, the man said, surprising both the pastor and Abby's future husband. I think we're ready, Abby said, smiling as brightly as she could. The pastor nodded, turning all his attention to the couple before him. He led them through simple vows, and invited Bastian to kiss his bride at the end. Bastian looked at her as if she had just crawled out from under a rock, but finally, he leaned down and kissed her. It was just a peck on her lips, but it was good enough. She was married. Pa stood and shook the pastor's hand. Goodbye, girl. Be obedient to your husband. He said nothing else as he left the church and headed back to camp. Bastian looked at Abby. My wagon is over by the general store, but it's not a long walk. We'll go get it and drive to my house at the top of the hill. Abby nodded. Yes, sir. I'm not a sir. Just a Bastian, he said, holding the door for her. People call me Abby, she said softly. She wished she understood why he'd given her such an odd look when he was told to kiss her, but she thrust the thought from her mind. She would be the best wife he could ask for. He'd traded 6 oxen for her after all. As they walked toward the store, she asked, Do you have family nearby? He nodded. Yup. When he didn't elaborate, she smiled. He seemed a bit awkward to her, but she liked him. Who is close? My pa, my 2 brothers and their wives, and my sister and her husband. Kids. I see. Did you lose your mother? He shook his head. Nope, we know just where she's buried on the trail. Abby blinked a few times. He wasn't joking about the death of his mother, was he? Surely not. I know where mine is buried as well, she finally said, unsure what else to say. I don't like your pa, Bastian said after a moment of silence. She smiled. It was nice to know her husband was good at reading people. He's a good man, but never much cared for me. I could tell. He told me you were only worth 4 oxen, but I said I wouldn't give less than 6. He needed the oxen, and I needed a wife. My sister and sisters-in-law have been cooking for me for far too long. There aren't any young ladies in town, she asked. Not that don't know me. She wasn't sure if she'd misheard him, but she let it go. Life with Bastian was going to be interesting, to say the least. Chapter 2. When they'd reached the general store, Bastian asked Abby, "Is there anything you need to get?" "I don't keep anything for food preparation in my cabin. My sister, stepmom, and sisters-in-law take turns having me over for meals, so I don't have to worry about that at all." "That's nice. Am I right to think you can't cook?" Bastian shrugged. "I can do a couple of meals, but I don't like it. I figure a 6-oxen wife can do the cooking." Abby smiled. "I'm happy to cook. But I'm surprised you insisted on paying 2 extra oxen for me. Pa would have taken 2 oxen if you'd tried to barter with him." Bastian shook his head. "You're worth a lot more than 2 oxen or even 6 oxen. I think your father is being very short-sighted to get rid of you, unless he already has his eyes on a widow. Pa doesn't like people enough to even court a woman, let alone marry another. I don't know why he and Ma married, but whatever it was, everything was over as soon as she died." Abby took a deep breath. "I wasn't allowed to mourn her. If he saw me crying, he kicked me." "Well, I won't be treating you that way. We'll talk about all that after we shop. Don't worry about vegetables or meats. We're covered there. But we'll need things like flour and sugar, and all the other things a kitchen needs." "All right," she said. She followed him into the store, and he walked straight to the counter. Instead of following Bastian, Abby made a mental list of what she'd need as a wife. When she spotted some pretty red and white gingham, she decided to ask Bastian if he had curtains and a tablecloth. She could make something perfect with just a few yards of fabric. Bastian walked back to Abby. "You're thinking about something." Abby smiled. "I am. I was wondering if you had curtains and a tablecloth. I could make something nice out of this red gingham." "I don't. Never felt the need." "What is my budget?" she asked. Her pa had never let her step foot into a store without telling her how much she could spend. Surely, Bastian would feel the same. Bastian looked at her for a moment. "I just set it up with the owner for you to have credit here. You tell him what we need, and it'll be taken care of." She eyed him skeptically. "I'm sure you don't want me to buy too much though. A budget would really help me." He thought about it for a moment. "Keep it under $500. That's the amount the Jensens owe us for providing and delivering meat to them and some of their customers. We never use all the credit we have here." Abby's jaw dropped at the amount of money. "I don't think I could spend that much if I tried." He shrugged. "Spend it or someone else in the family will. But we're always doing business with Jensen, and he won't mind if we owe him a little, because he'll end up using the credit up for more beef. And chickens. And goat cheese. Oh my." She'd had no idea what Bastian did, but it sounded like he raised a lot of different animals. Since she didn't know how often he'd bring her into town, she ordered all she needed. Walking to the man behind the counter, she said, "I need 50 pounds of flour, 25 pounds of sugar, 10 pounds of brown sugar, 6 yards of the red gingham." Her list went on from there. The man just nodded and got what she'd asked for. When it was time to cut the fabric, he frowned. "My wife, Penelope, usually cuts the yard goods for me, but she's home with a sick baby. I have no idea how to do it." Abby smiled. "You measure it out, and I'll cut it." "Thank you. I'll give you a penny off per yard for doing the work for me." She was happy to be able to save some of the money she was spending on her order. It made her feel that she would be less of a burden to Bastian and his family. She hoped his sister and sisters-in-law were kind people. It was definitely what she needed after saying goodbye to her best friend since childhood. After the wagon had been loaded by Mr. Jensen, Bastian helped her up and climbed into the wagon himself. We're not far from here, but the hill is steep, so we typically bring the wagon down when we need to buy anything. Just makes things easier all around. Sounds good, Abby said, thankful that he wasn't demanding anything from her or berating her in any way. She'd almost forgotten what it was like to be treated like she was valued. Her mother had only been gone for 1 month, but it had been a long, hard month. He drove up a hill on a road that had been forged by wagons over the years the settlement had been there, stopping near the top. He hurried around the wagon and helped her down. I'll show you around, but I have to be quick about it. My father and brothers expected me back a long time ago. They hate it when I get distracted and don't do everything I'm supposed to do. He carried in the flour and sugar for her. You'll have to unload the rest. No time. She nodded. There wasn't much to the cabin, and she didn't need him to show her around. There was a kitchen and dining area, a bedroom, and a loft. What was there to see? She was grateful for every square inch of space after so long on the trail though. They'd left April 15th, and it was already September 15th. She couldn't wait for him to leave so she could sit on a bed and remember what mattresses felt like. You can go, she said softly. I'll show myself around. Bastian nodded. Supper at 5, he said as he headed for the door. She was surprised he'd left so abruptly, but Bastian didn't seem like other men. As soon as he was gone, she explored the small house, wondering if she was supposed to sleep upstairs or in the bedroom with him. Either way, she needed to get the wagon unloaded and start supper. So, she carried in each of her purchases, setting the food in the kitchen area. There was a handle on the floor that she was certain led down to the cellar. Hopefully, there would be some food down there, but if not, she'd wander until she found someone who could help her. Bastian had said the whole family lived close. What were the chances she could knock on all the doors and not find either a member of his family, or someone who could point her to a relative of his? As soon as she had stored everything where she wanted it, and laid on the bed for just a moment, wondering if she was going to be spoiled by the sheer comfort of it, she wandered outside. Around 200 yards away was another cabin much like the one she was in. She decided to try it first. She walked to the cabin and knocked, waiting patiently for someone to hear her. She could hear laughter from inside the house, and she certainly hoped she was in the right place. Laughter was exactly what she needed in life. A pretty brunette with a well-rounded belly came to the door, her face lit up by the smile that reached her eyes. Hello. Abby couldn't help but smile back. Hello. I married Bastian a couple of hours ago, and he said his sisters-in-law and his sister would have food for me to fix for supper. That's wonderful. I'm Fiona. I'm Abigail, but my friends call me Abby. Abby it is. Fiona looked over her shoulder. Bastian's wife is here. There were suddenly 3 other women peeking at her. I'm Henri, Bastian's sister. I'm Emma, Bastian's brother Jared's wife, said another woman with beautiful dark hair. I'm Melody, Bastian's stepmother. I married into the family just a bit over a year ago. I hope there won't be a quiz. Abby said, glad to see that the women were used to working together. She didn't know what they'd been doing, but there had been laughter involved, and she had a sudden longing to be accepted into the lives these women shared. Where are my manners? Fiona asked. Come in. Come in. Did you arrive with the other immigrants who were camping here tonight? Fiona nodded. I did. For a moment, she struggled for an explanation, but she decided the truth was the simplest thing. My father traded me to Bastian for 6 oxen. Henri looked enraged. Your father sold you? And Bastian bought you? How could anyone think that was all right? Truthfully, I was happy Bastian was willing to be the one to trade for me. My father hasn't been himself since my mother died a month ago. Fiona shook her head. No one is happy when their spouse dies, but as far as I know, you're the only one to be traded for oxen. She waved her hand toward the table. Take a seat. We're just putting up some green beans. Don't worry, you'll get your share. I didn't help grow them. Abby protested. Henri smiled. I didn't help at all with the growing last summer, and I still got all my family needed. I was expecting, and it was too much for me. Fiona nodded. And I was expecting all winter, and the girls helped me out a great deal. We're family now, and we're helping each other. After a moment of consideration, Abby nodded. Thank you. You're so welcome, Emma said, scooping some of the beans into a jar. The women obviously had a system, because they worked together very efficiently. When a baby cried from the other room, Melody said, "That would be my baby." She handed Abby the rag she'd been holding. Your turn. Abby quickly took her new mother-in-law's spot in the assembly line. It was amazing to her that they already trusted her to help, but then again, there were 4 of them and 1 of her. What could she possibly do to derail the process? While they worked, the women laughed and joked. They had so much to say, it was as if they'd been apart for months. Do you work together often? Abby asked when there was a lull in the conversation. Henri laughed. Every day, usually. It's just so much nicer to have friends around. Emma and Fiona have the biggest homes, but we travel to them all at one time or another. Why do you move from home to home? Abby asked. More fun that way, Emma said with a grin. When we're not gardening, we're cleaning and cooking, so we just do it all together. I don't think any of us planned this when we started out, but it works beautifully. We scrubbed every inch of Fiona's home this morning before we started canning. Tomorrow, we're all going to Melody's, and that's really where we should do all the canning. She has a nice big kitchen with a real cook stove. Which house is Melody's? Abby asked. And may I come along? Of course, Emma said. Your family, and even if we're just sewing, we can talk as we go along, and it keeps the loneliness at bay. I think marrying Bastian may have been the best thing I could have done. Melody walked in then. It has to be, she said with a smile. It was the best thing for me as well. She snuggled her baby close, sitting in a chair so she could easily nurse. Where are you from? Fiona asked Abby. We all know each other. Tell us why you were on the trail. I just turned 18 and was still living with my parents when my pa decided we were going west. The doctor warned Pa that Ma was too sick to make the trip, but he wouldn't listen, so I agreed to take care of Ma and do as much of her work as possible. She died last month, and I've been taking care of my Pa since, but he never much cared for me. I'd rather the whole town didn't know I was sold for 6 oxen, but at least Bastian talked him up from 4 to 6. Henri laughed. Only Bastian would negotiate in the other direction, but I think he's right. You're more of a 6 oxen wife than a 4. Even Abby had to laugh at that. Oh, and I'm from Pennsylvania. Emma smiled. The men are ranching here, but we've made them add more and more animals for us to take care of as we've gone along. We have chickens, goats, horses, cattle, hogs, and even a kitten or 2. Oh, do you think I could pick an animal? Henri laughed. I don't know how many animals are left with all we have. And the men do serious hunting in the fall, so we also have a lot of game. Emma nodded. Mainly my brother Roy. He's an amazing hunter. Seriously, he can hunt anything. Turkeys? Abby suggested. I know nothing about them, but I could raise turkeys. The other women all exchanged a look and laughed. Turkeys sound great, Emma said. I don't believe anyone in town raises them, but wild turkeys are always running around. We'll see if Roy can set up a trap that will catch a couple, but not kill them. Abby smiled. If she had some way to contribute to this family, she would feel much better about herself. I love a good turkey dinner. Henri nodded. I do as well, and it gets tiring to ask Roy to go shoot another all the time. Better to raise them. I have a question. They all turned their attention to Abby, the assembly line, stopping completely. When I asked Bastian if there weren't girls around who he could marry, he said, not ones who don't know me. Which made me wonder why he'd say such a thing. Henri looked at her. I'm probably the best one to answer that. Bastian is a bit odd. He's funny and fun to be around, but seems a little slow in some ways. He doesn't really know how to talk to women or be charming, for example. Abby nodded. If that's all it was, she could certainly work with that. It was good to know he didn't have a checkered past. Chapter 3. When it was time to head home for supper, Abby was given chicken, carrots, and potatoes, 2 of the few vegetables Bastian would eat. At least they were according to Henri, who seemed to know everything about her brothers. She hurried home and fried up the chicken and put the potatoes on to boil. The carrots cooked in a small pot as well. She was surprised at how well equipped Bastian's bachelor kitchen was, but she was definitely pleased by it. It was so easy to make a meal. If only she had a stove like Fiona's, she would be in heaven. While she cooked, she took stock of the cabin, and found that she'd landed in much better circumstances than she would have if she'd completed her journey to Oregon City. Here, she was the mistress of her own home, and she didn't have to deal with her father's moods. No, this was right where she wanted to be. Once the potatoes had been boiled and the chicken was fried, she made some gravy from the drippings. She'd seen a big, beautiful stove at the store that day, and it was less than $100. Surely, he wouldn't mind buying that for her with all he'd offered. When Bastian came in at the end of his day, he sniffed deeply. Something smells good. Abby smiled. I made fried chicken and mashed potatoes. I hope you'll like it. Anything is better than cooking for myself. He washed his hands from the pitcher on the counter and sat down at the table. How much longer? She pulled the gravy off the stove. This is the last thing. I didn't get around to baking bread, but I did help put up some green beans for winter. He nodded. I knew you were worth 6 oxen. Abby wasn't certain if she should be flattered or offended, so she let the comment go. I didn't know if I should put my things in the loft or in the bedroom, so I put them in the bedroom, and I'll put them up in the loft if you'd prefer. Bastian nodded, bowing his head to pray. He'd barely finished when there was a loud knock on the door. He wiped his mouth on his napkin, walking to the door. He opened it wide to find his father and 2 brothers looking at him. What's wrong? He asked. They all came into the house, and Pa was shaking his head. You didn't think to tell us that you were late because you got married this afternoon? Bastian shrugged. I was late. That's that. There was a moment of silence as Abby wondered if Bastian would introduce them. When he didn't, she stood. I'm Abby. Nice to meet you, the oldest of the 3 men said. Abby Appleby, another of them mused. I'm Jared, the oldest brother. I'm Sam, and I'm the middle brother, the 3rd man said. Melody is whipping up a cake so we can at least have wedding cake to celebrate your wedding, Pa said. Come up to the house after supper. Bastian shrugged. I think Abby needs to do dishes after supper. After the dishes are done then, Pa said, shaking his head. You need to stop being so literal, boy. I just like things to make sense, Bastian replied. I want to raise turkeys, Abby said. Everyone seems to have their own animal, and that's what I want to raise. Pa shrugged. Guess we're building another enclosure tomorrow, boys. No one seemed to think much of her desire to raise turkeys. They just saw it as work to be done, which is how Abby thought it should be. Everyone should take the work they had and tackle it head on. The men filed out of the house and Bastian and Abby returned to the table. I wish you'd told your family we were married. Why? He asked. They know now. She decided to leave that as it was. He certainly was different than most of the men she knew. Do you want me to leave my clothes in your room? Sure, he said. Married people sleep together. Yes, they do, she said. She hadn't considered the idea of their wedding night, but he was a handsome man. She was certain they could muddle through it. After she'd finished the dishes, they walked over to the big house and had cake with the entire family. Even Henry's husband Roy was there to be a part of it. This cake is delicious, Abby said after her first bite. Roy sat on one side of Abby and Jared on the other. Abby had learned through conversations that day that Henri and Jared had married Roy and Emma, who were also brother and sister. She looked back and forth between them. Roy took a bite of his cake. I'm not sure Bastian knows what a wedding night is about, he said. Jared nodded emphatically. Don't be surprised if he runs screaming into the night. He does that sometimes. The two men continued to tease her about Bastian, and as she finished her cake, she pushed it away. Maybe you two should go bother someone else. She was getting annoyed with their behavior. Henri noticed what was happening then. She grabbed Roy's arm and nodded to Emma to get Jared. If he doesn't get a wedding night because of you, I'm going to smack you. Emma said to Jared. I was just teasing, Jared said, looking down. Me too, Roy said, not sure if he should be apologizing or running from his wife. She was kind and sweet but had a temper, and he didn't want it directed at him. You both should be apologizing to Bastian, Abby said, glaring at the two men. The other women reminded Abby that she was to meet them at Melody's house the following morning, and she agreed. As they left the house, Abby was quiet, wondering what exactly Bastian was thinking. He was a man who liked to tease from what she'd been told, but he hadn't teased her at all. They walked to the cabin, and he held the door for her. When they got inside, he looked at her for a moment. So did the guys make you not want to have our wedding night? He asked. Abby smiled, walking to her new husband, prepared to let him do whatever he wanted. He'd traded 6 oxen for her after all. It's our wedding night. We can't have it next month, she said. He chuckled. I'm glad the guys didn't bug you then. They don't mean to be idiots. It's just part of who they are. She put her arms around his neck. It's fine. Some men are just silly, that's all. Bastian laughed, leaning down to kiss her. She'd never been kissed except the peck at her wedding, though she'd thought about it a lot, especially when she'd talked with Anna. Anna had given her more information about what was supposed to happen on a wedding night than her mother ever had. The kiss surprised her in its intensity. At the church, he'd seemed so shy when he'd kissed her, but now, he seemed to want to hurry things along. She couldn't blame him though. It was their wedding night after all. She took his hand and led him into the bedroom, shutting the door behind her. I'm glad you were the one to trade for me, she said softly. Me too. I thought you'd cook and clean, but here we are, about to consummate our marriage. I'm glad because I've wanted to do it for a long time. She bit her lip to keep from laughing at the casual way he'd announced he'd wanted marital relations. She did find the way he was so forthright about everything very refreshing. She reached out to unbutton his shirt, noting the surprise on his face. Is it all right that I'm doing this? She asked. He nodded. But I thought I was supposed to undress both of us. My married friend said she undresses her husband pretty often. Then I guess it's all right for you to undress me. He waited as she finished unbuttoning his shirt and it fell to the floor. She stared at the vast expanse of his chest for a moment, surprised at the muscles she found but not entirely sure why. He was obviously a hard worker and ran a ranch with his father and brothers. Of course, he was strong. He turned her around and unbuttoned the back of her dress, and she stepped out of it. She hadn't worn her corset since they had started out from Independence, Missouri, so she was a bit worried he wouldn't like how her waist had thickened during the long trek, but he made no complaints. When she turned around to face him again in just her petticoat and drawers, it was strange, knowing he was looking at her as no man ever had before. She stood still and proud as he looked at her body, trailing one finger from her breast down to her waist. Cows only get big in their udders when they are milking. Why are women big there when they're not nursing a baby? Abby couldn't help but smile. I'm not really sure why, she said. I like it, he said. I'm glad. She moved closer to him, so she was pressed right up against him. That feels nice. I think it would feel nicer if you weren't wearing any clothes, he said. With his words, he pushed the petticoat off her shoulders and then her knickers down to her feet. There. Now I like you even better. He pulled her to him so she was pressed right up against him, before lowering his head to kiss her. She put her arms around him, her hands exploring his back while they kissed. I think you should lie down now, he said. I'll get my britches off for myself. She couldn't stop the smile that transformed her face. He was a good man. She could feel it. And then she could feel him. He spent a moment toying with her breast, and then he was atop her and inside her. She wasn't certain it was supposed to happen so quickly, but he seemed content, and for that moment, that was enough for her. She wanted to please him, and when she heard his shout just before he rolled off her, she could only assume she had. He kept one arm around her for a while, and then rolled with his back to her. I don't like to be touching anyone while I sleep. That's all right, Abby said. She didn't care if she touched someone while she slept, but she was used to sleeping alone, so it didn't matter that he didn't like it. She laid awake for a while, wishing she'd found the bliss that Anna had told her was part of the marriage act, but she was sure it would happen. Maybe the next time. She woke before dawn, as was her habit, and she went into the kitchen to fix breakfast. She'd forgotten that she had no eggs, so she hurried out to where she'd been told the chickens had their own area in the barn. There she found 6 eggs and carried them home. She'd been fascinated by Johnny cakes on the trail, but she was sick of them now. She'd make some pancakes for breakfast. Everyone loved pancakes. As she was squatted in front of the fireplace cooking, she thought about the stove she wanted. She'd have to ask Bastian if she could have one after he woke. When Bastian got up, he immediately went out to the barn. I need to milk the cows, he said on his way out the door. She had no time to respond or talk to him about anything. There was plenty of time, though. After watching him eat the night before, she had a feeling that Bastian never turned down a meal. When he returned inside, the food was ready, and they sat and said a quick prayer. I was wondering something, she said after she'd taken her first bite of pancakes. She couldn't believe how much she'd missed them. What's that? He asked. I saw a cook stove in the store yesterday. Could I get one? He shrugged. I don't see why not. I think all of the girls have one now. When? She asked, hoping it would be soon. She could cook over an open fire easily, but she really missed the joy of cooking on a stove. It was so much easier. I'll get the men to go down with me today. We'll have it installed before supper. Thank you. She was surprised he wasn't arguing with her, but she'd already determined that her new family was more affluent than her last had been. Sure. I don't mind at all. We do so much bartering in this valley that you always owe someone a favor, or they owe you one. With the store, they owe us. That's a good thing, she said. He nodded. It's best to use up the credit, or money will have to exchange hands at the end of the year. We have to pay taxes on money, but not when we barter. I never thought of that, she said. We're happy to pay taxes, of course, but sometimes, it's nice not to have to. Bastian took another bite of pancakes. This is delicious. I've missed pancakes. The corn flour lasted so much longer that we only had Johnny cakes on the trail. I got sick of Johnny cakes, but I like them again now that we're not eating them most mornings. My sister is a fabulous cook, but you're good too. You were worth 6 oxen for sure, and maybe even 8. Thank you, Abby said, deciding to take any references to her worth oxen as compliments. What else could she do? What are your plans for the day? He asked. We're all meeting at Melody's house, she said. I don't remember what we're doing there, but I said I'd go. It seems the women work together most days. He nodded. Do you really want to raise turkeys? I do. I love turkey and dressing. All right. I don't mind. But the children have to come first. The children? She asked. The children we're going to have, because we had a wedding night. Abby smiled. We will have children, I'm sure. I'm excited about it. Me too. But they have to be cared for properly. Do you know how to take care of a baby? Bastian asked. She nodded. I do. I've never done it before, but I know how. You probably need to spend more time with the other women then. They'll show you. I'll do that. Chapter 4. Emma stopped by while Abby was doing the breakfast dishes. She immediately took a towel to wipe them dry and helped out. We're the only two without little ones who aren't expecting, Emma said. How would you feel about going to the garden with me and picking peas before we head to Melody's this morning? I had planned to get the picking done after supper, but when Melody made the cake for your wedding, we had to go there instead. I'd be happy to help. Abby said. I want to contribute to the family. Especially since Bastian is getting me a cook stove today. Wonderful. It makes meals so much easier. Emma said. I have one too, but I live in a large house as well. Next summer, Fiona gets her house, and I guess you'll get yours the next summer. Abby's eyes widened. I'm happy with the cabin. I don't need something bigger. The cabin was as big as the cabin she'd shared with her parents back east. Oh, you'll want a bigger house soon. Fiona told Sam she needed a cook stove when she agreed to marry him, so she's had one for over a year. It's your turn. I was worried I was spending too much of the family's money. Emma shook her head. No, you're not. The Applebys were one of the wealthiest families to come west with us. Well, I'm happy to get that stove then. I'll try to be careful about what I spend. Emma laughed. I told Jared he needed to come home with 10 dozen jars today. I'm not terribly worried about what I spend. Thank you for telling me that. It makes me feel a lot better about what I spend. Hey, we're sisters now. We have to share secrets, don't we? I really like the way you think. Are we canning peas today? Emma nodded. Hence the need to pick them. She wiped the last dish and put it away. Are you ready? Let me just grab my bonnet. Ma always warned me about how dark my face gets. The two of them went to the garden together and picked the peas. It only took an hour and then they were at Melody's. Abby was given the job of shelling the peas while the others took care of other tasks. She didn't bother to pay attention to what the others did as she worked on the peas. She could follow orders and do her share without any problem. Shortly after lunch that day, she realized she was laughing and joking along with the other women. If anyone were to come to the house as she had the day before, they would assume she'd known the other women for years. Oh, she was happy her father had traded her for 6 oxen. Maybe she hadn't enjoyed her marital relations yet, but she would. She was sure of it. She was again given beef, potatoes, and carrots for their supper. Making a stew would be perfect, especially if she had her new stove. She couldn't wait to cook on it and not squat in front of the fire. She even planned to make a loaf of bread for supper that night. Surely, Bastian would enjoy fresh bread. When she got home, the cook stove was right where she'd told Bastian she wanted it. It was all ready for her to use, and she couldn't be happier with it. She started a big pot of stew on the stove and then worked on mixing her bread dough. She wanted him to be happy with the meal she made. As soon as he was home, she hurried to him and threw her arms around him, thanking him for the stove. "You have no idea how much this means to me." "It means your life is easier," Bastian said, looking at her as if she'd lost her mind. "Yes, it does. So, thank you." "You're welcome." He sat at the table. "What did you cook on your new stove?" "Just stew and some bread." She hoped he wouldn't be disappointed. "As long as it's not bear, I'll love it," he said. "You don't like bear meat?" She'd eaten it often as a child but had never much cared for it. It would be nice if he didn't either, she wouldn't have to cook it. "Not at all. Only Jared likes it, and I think that means he's insane." She laughed. "I'm not fond of it either. Now I never have to put it on the table." He smiled a little. "Thanks for that." Once she had supper on the table and they were eating, he asked, "When are you making the curtains and the tablecloth?" "It's harvest season. We're all working on harvesting the garden and putting up the foods for next year." "So, when you're done with harvest?" "Most likely. I didn't know I'd be so busy with the harvest when I bought the fabric." He shrugged. "I don't care either way, I just thought you wanted to get it done soon." "Not when I can be harvesting and contributing to our food for next year." He nodded. "All right. Do you like pie?" he asked. "Pie? I love pie. Emma said I could have some of the raspberry pie filling they put up last month if I wanted it." "Yes, please," he said. "I live for pie. I love chicken pot pie, and turkey pie, and beef pie, and cherry pie, and apple pie. I love pie." There are still blackberries to pick from the garden, and Fiona said some apple trees are near her father's house. "I would happily go pick some." He smiled. "Apple trees? I'll make sure I get there this week. They should all be ripe." "Week is over," he said. "Tomorrow is Sunday. Your company is still camped here. I heard they plan to attend church in the morning." "Oh, it'll be nice to have a chance to say goodbye then," Abby said. Saying goodbye to Anna would be hard, but they'd already done it once, so surely they could do it again. She wished she felt as if she could give her friend food to help her on their journey, but she couldn't take food from her new family to give away. It wouldn't be right. Then she had a thought. Could I invite my friend and her husband for Sunday dinner? She knew she could get plenty of food from the other women. He shrugged. "Sure. I wouldn't mind." "Then I'll do that. I'm going to leave the dishes for a minute or two and run over to talk to Fiona about what I can make." "All right. I'm going to keep eating." Bastian cut himself another slice of bread and applied butter to it. Abby all but ran to Fiona's cabin and asked about food. "Oh, sure. I have some salt pork that would work well, or if you want something a little fancier, I could spare a chicken or beef." "Anything," Abby said. "I'm a beggar, and I'll be happy to take what you give me." Fiona smiled. "Let me look then." Abby stepped inside and waited while Fiona found something. Sam was sitting at the table still eating. "I'm sorry to disturb your supper," Abby said. "Don't worry about it," Sam said. Fiona hurried back to her. 2 pieces of salt pork. It should be more than enough for 4, and you can do what you want with it. When we got off the trail, all my family cared about was not eating more beans." Abby laughed. "Just a few days ago I was telling my friend, Anna, that if I had to eat beans even one more time, I might have to hurt someone." Fiona nodded emphatically. I can eat them again, but they still don't make me happy. I used to love nights when we had beans. As Abby walked back home, she thought about what she'd make with the salt pork. Of course, her friend wouldn't care one way or the other. She didn't have to cook and would have something other than beans. Anna wouldn't care about anything else. Bastian had just finished eating when she got home, and she immediately started the dishes. To her surprise, Bastian found a book on horse training and sat at the table reading it while she worked. "Are you interested in horse training?" she asked. He looked up from the book, his face lit up. "I am. I want to teach them how to behave themselves and start selling them. We have lots more horses than we need and a good stallion. Several good mares. We only use geldings to work on the ranch, so we do not need to keep them other than to breed. Thank goodness Doc doesn't mind working on animals. Some doctors think animal care is beneath them. I didn't realize this town had a doctor." He nodded, grinning. "We were on the best wagon train. We had a doctor, a minister, a blacksmith, and wonderful cooks with us. All of us pretty much settled together, so it's easy to build the town around the core people we need so much." "Was everyone here part of your company on the trail?" "Not everyone. Fiona's father married a woman from the first wagon train to come through here last year. Melody was on the same train. It's really nice to have new marriage prospects coming through town all the time." "I can see that it would be," Abby replied. "I'm glad new people are coming in as well. This town is really going to grow." "Not too big, I hope," Bastian said. "I like this small town the way it is." She smiled and nodded. "I do too. I'm glad you were the one who traded for me," she said. "If you make me an apple pie soon, I'll find your father and make him take 2 more oxen for you. You're a 15 oxen bride." "No doubt in my mind." She laughed softly. He was hung up on how many oxen she was worth, and she wasn't about to argue with him. She finished the dishes in silence, knowing he was reading his book. Most men she'd known didn't think they should spend their evenings reading anything, but Bastian was different. She could see why maybe some of the women in town didn't think much of him, but he seemed like a good man to her. Despite his idiosyncrasies, she knew she'd soon be in love with him. Part of her heart was already his. As soon as the dishes were finished, she looked at him. "We still have an hour or 2 of daylight. We should go pick apples now." He didn't have to be asked twice. Bastian was on his feet in an instant. "You get the baskets, and I'll hitch up the wagon." On the drive to where Fiona had told her the apples were, Abby asked Bastian what they'd done at work that day. "Oh, we got jars for Emma and the stove for you. Once everything was where it should be, we started building an enclosure for the turkeys. I wish we could stick them in with the chickens, but from what I've been told, it's not safe to do that. So, the turkeys will get their own building and fenced yard, just like the chickens. As soon as it's built, I'm going to start working on tracking some turkeys for you. We only need 2 to start a flock." "Do you know how to build a trap that will work for them?" she asked. "Never tried it, but most things I set my mind to doing get done." She loved the idea of having her turkeys all together ready for her to raise them. "Who takes care of the chickens?" she asked. "Emma. Her mother is a bit of a chicken expert, so she works with the chickens. I do the hogs. Fiona brought in the goats." "What about Melody?" "She had a baby before she could pick an animal. I think she's too enthralled with her baby to really care about raising any animals. I could see her with bunnies though. I'm not sure if she'd have the heart to make them into a pie, though." Abby's lips twitched. "You really do want some pie, don't you?" "There's no other reason I would spend a Saturday night out picking apples," he said, turning onto the land where the apples filled the trees. "This isn't anyone's land, so we're just going to pick them." They each took a basket and picked all the apples they could. "Do you like apple butter?" she asked. He shrugged. It's all right. I like apple pies better. Of course, you do, she said, grinning. What about cobbler? Do you like cobbler? He nodded emphatically. Love cobbler. It's almost like pie, but not exactly. Cake? She asked. He shrugged. I like all sweets, but pie is my very favorite. I think everyone should have pie at least twice a week. Abby hated making pie crusts, but she didn't complain. She would be happy to serve him in any way she could. Once both baskets were full, he asked if it was enough for a pie. This is enough for a few pies, she said. But more would be better. Do you think Emma would come out here with me on Monday to pick more? Ask her, he said. He didn't know or care what Emma wanted to do. She had cooked a terrible meal for him once, and he didn't trust her much since then. It had been a joke, but it had been bad enough he thought he'd die after eating it. I'll ask her at church tomorrow then, she said. Do you not like Emma? Emma's all right. She's not a great cook though. Not like you and Henri and Fiona and Melody. She made lunch for all of us today, and it was delicious, Abby said, glancing at him and trying to understand. Henri had to teach her to cook. If we have a church social, make sure you don't get Mrs. Williams's food. She can only make jerky and is a terrible cook otherwise. I'll keep that in mind. From his words, she had to surmise that Mrs. Williams was Emma's mother. That night when they went to bed together, it was much more pleasant for Abby. Bastian took his time with her, and they both enjoyed themselves. He held her for a moment, reminding her that he didn't like to be touched while sleeping. That's all right, she said to reassure him. Life with Sebastian was good. Maybe it wasn't what she'd dreamed marriage would be, but it wasn't terrible either. She now had her husband and a new family, and she knew things would only improve. Chapter 5. Abby woke up excited the following morning. She rinsed the salt off the pork and started a low fire in her new stove. Adding some water, potatoes, and carrots, she decided to make the pork as a roast. Once everything was started, she mixed the dough for bread before rolling out a pie crust. She'd make an apple pie for dessert. She knew her friend would be happy to have food that she didn't have to cook and wasn't prepared over a campfire. By the time Bastian was awake, she already had the pie put together and ready to go in the oven. I'm going to do the milking, he said, leaving the house without so much as a good morning. She shook her head. Her Bastian was full of idiosyncrasies, but he was a good man. He came back with eggs and milk, looking at her. What are you doing? He asked. I have our Sunday dinner in the oven. Why? He frowned. I think you skipped a meal. She laughed. I'm about to start breakfast. Would you rather have pancakes, Johnny cakes, or eggs? Eggs and toast, please. Abby nodded, and immediately started slicing what was left of the loaf of bread they'd had with supper the night before. She was making 3 loaves that day because she had a little bit more time on her hands. She really did need to see how much laundry needed to be washed. Monday was her preferred wash day. It had always been the day her mother did it, and it seemed to work out. Once the toast was in the oven, she added a bit of the butter Henri had given her and waited for it to melt. Scrambled eggs, all right? She asked. No, I don't like scrambled. I like mine with all the white done, but the yolk runny. Will do, she said. She preferred her eggs the same way. She only wished she had bacon to go with the meal. She had already learned that Bastian thought there should be meat and potatoes with every meal. There was just no time to make hash browns, because Bastian was hungry. It didn't take long before the food was on the table. Bastian looked down at his eggs and poked them with a fork before he was satisfied they were done the way he wanted. After the meal, she cleaned the kitchen. What time does church start? She asked. 10. I like to leave about 10 minutes before. She frowned. You don't socialize before church? He shook his head adamantly. All those voices in that room. It makes me want to stick my fingers in my ears and run away screaming. I see. But she didn't. Who would feel that way about being with other followers of Christ? Can we go a little earlier so I can talk to my friend about coming for Sunday dinner? I don't want to miss having her over because we arrived too late. Maybe you could wait in the wagon for those few minutes. I guess that's all right. He really didn't understand why she had to be early, but he'd accommodate her. This once. Thank you. I really appreciate it. She glanced at the clock and saw that it was only 8. She didn't want to wait to see Anna. Why don't I walk down to the campsite and ask Anna and her husband for dinner, and I'll meet you at the church. That way you can go when you want to. He frowned. Why don't you want to go to church with me? I do. Don't think that. I only have a couple more hours I can spend with my friend before she disappears forever. I'll drive you down, he said. He really didn't want her to be around her father without him being there. He was afraid the older man would hurt her. Of course, she was smart enough to avoid her father, but he felt safer being with her. He went out and hitched up the wagon, and she changed into her best dress, which wasn't at all fancy, but practical. It would be nice to have something prettier, but she'd already gotten a new stove. She wouldn't be asking for anything else for a good long while. When he came back inside, he also changed into his Sunday best. He wasn't wearing a suit but wore a nice pair of black slacks, a clean white shirt, a vest, and a tie. He topped off the look with a black cowboy hat. In her eyes, he looked incredibly handsome. Are you ready? He asked. I am. Do you plan to go straight to church from the campsite? I do, if that's all right with you. I'm just along for the ride, he said. As he drove down the hill and to the campsite, he talked nonstop about what he'd read in his horse training book. He talked about how he'd be able to incorporate it into his business. I need to convince Pa that I should be allowed to work with horses all day instead of helping mend fences. He shook his head. When we drive the cattle to market next month, I want to stay home. You don't think he'll let you? Bastian shrugged. He thinks we must spend all our time building the cattle ranch. Then we can work on our other projects. I disagree. So many out here don't even have a horse and use oxen instead. They would be thrilled to get a trained horse in trade or even pay for it. Maybe you could spend your Sundays off working with horses. I'd be happy to help. He glanced at her and laughed. A little thing like you? You couldn't help me. Abby frowned. I believe I could. He stopped the wagon outside the circle of wagons the company had made. Go talk to your friend. You should come as well, she said. Her husband is a nice man. Bastian could tell it was important to her, so he got down and helped her to the ground. Let's go. Together, they made their way through the circle of wagons to where her friend and Stephen were. Anna's whole face lit up. I was hoping I'd get to see you today. Abby nodded. When I heard you were staying here one more day, I thought I'd invite you to Sunday dinner. I already have it in the oven. Anna looked at Stephen, who nodded. We'd be honored. Abby smiled. Stephen, this is my husband, Bastian. Bastian, this is Anna and Stephen. Anna has been my best friend since before either of us could walk. We lived next door to each other, and our mothers were good friends. Bastian nodded. Nice to meet you both. Abby noticed he didn't really look at the others, instead focusing on something behind them. Bastian and his father and brothers own a large ranch together. Bastian is studying and learning all he can about horse training. He wants to breed horses once the ranch is established. Anna smiled. How long has your family been here, Bastian? Since 1851. We settled here in October, so a little less than 2 years. We love it here. The winters are hard, but the summers are cooler. He shrugged. It's a good place to start over. Stephen nodded. Do you know if there are any plots left near here? Oh, sure. There are lots. You'd be on the outskirts of the settlement, but close enough to shop here and attend our church. Stephen smiled at Anna. I think we'll be back in the spring then. What are you going to do over the winter? Bastian asked. We deliberately left earlier than we probably should have so we could settle before winter set in. Stephen shrugged. We have a bit of money saved up. We'll rent a house or live in a boarding house, whatever we can find. But we'll be back in the spring, and my Anna can have her best friend close by. Bastian nodded. Sounds like a good plan. Do you intend to ranch? Stephen shook his head. I plan to farm. Crops, not animals. We'll have a cow or two for milk, but that's it. Anna looked over Abby's shoulder. Your pa is coming this way. Abby sighed. Pretend you don't see him. But her pa walked straight over and glared at his daughter. He's ready to trade you back, isn't he? Well, I'm not giving up my oxen. I don't need to be burdened with the likes of you. He pulled back his hand to hit her, but Bastian caught his wrist. You will not hit my wife. Pa looked at Bastian curiously. You're keeping her? This woman is worth at least 15 oxen, so I know I got the better part of the deal. You will never hit her again. If I have my way, you will never see her again. You are evil, thinking that hitting and kicking your daughter is all right. I don't know what lies she told you. Bastian frowned. There were no lies. She has barely mentioned you. I'm speaking from what I personally seen you try to do. Her father turned away in disgust. She needs a firm hand or she'll go wild on you. No one wants a wild wife. I think we're going to be all right, but thank you, Mr. Lund. Her father stomped back to his lonely campsite, where he appeared to be trying to cook a meal for himself. Excuse me, Abby said, following her father. What can I make you to eat, Pa? Her father glared at her. I haven't eaten since you left me here to rot. I understand. I could put a couple of potatoes on the fire, and you could have baked potatoes after church. They'd go well with some of the jerky. Or you could invite me to eat with you and your husband. Abby shook her head. No, I couldn't. Bastian would never allow you in our cabin. She felt a rush of emotion for her husband, knowing what she said was true. Bastian could see her father's true nature, and he would never want the man anywhere near her. Her father frowned. Fine. Baked potatoes and jerky work. Let me show you how to make the potatoes, she said. She knew her father had picked up some potatoes at the mercantile in town, and she was happy to teach him to do for himself. Bastian walked over and stood beside her watching everything she did. She showed him how to scrub the dirt off the potatoes, make several punctures, and then bury them in the ashes of the fire. They'll take about 40 minutes, but you want to turn them every 10 minutes or so. They'll cook evenly that way. Her pa nodded. All right. I'm sure I could get Anna to fix extra food for you if you contributed to her food supply. Pa looked at her. Why would you do that for me? You're my pa, she said. Then do it. It will be nice not to have to try to find meals for myself. I'll talk to her. She got to her feet and smiled at Bastian, walking back toward Anna and Stephen's wagon. As they walked, Bastian asked, Why did you help him? She shrugged. I promised my ma I'd take care of him as best I could before he died. I don't see any reason to let him go hungry simply because I'm not finishing the journey. You're a good woman, Bastian said. You're worth at least 20 oxen. She smiled at him, enjoying how much he thought of her. He improved her worth daily, and that meant she was doing something right. Back at Anna and Stephen's camp, Abby asked her friend about cooking for her father. "He'll provide the food." Anna sighed. "I can just make enough for one more. He's a better hunter than my Stephen, so it'll be fine." "Thank you," Abby said, hugging her friend. "I feel like I should be taking care of him even if he did trade me for 6 oxen." "It should have been 20, Bastian said again. Anna laughed. "I think you're right, Bastian. At least 20. I'm not offering him more though. He's mean to my Abby." Abby's heart fluttered when he called her his. She didn't know why it felt so important that he did so, but she couldn't change how she felt. Anna frowned for a moment. "It's time to head to the church." "Ride with us," Abby said. "You'll want to ride up the hill as well, though, we've walked over much worse." Anna smiled. "But only when we had to." The 4 of them headed for the church. When they arrived, Bastian helped Abby down, but then stood where he was. "Get a pew and leave a spot on the aisle for me. I'll be in when I hear the music start." Abby nodded, standing on tiptoe to kiss his cheek. Despite his oddities, he was a good husband to her, and she didn't want him to be uncomfortable. Anna and Abby found a pew toward the back of the church, and they sat together, leaving the spot on the aisle for Bastian. People swarmed them, coming over to introduce themselves. They all seemed excited to have a new member of the community. When she told people she'd married Bastian, a few had smirked, but she didn't care. What did it matter if he was different? He was good to her. The sermon that day was on treating all those around you with kindness. If we're kind to others, and show them how we want to be treated, we'll have a much better chance of receiving kindness in return. Bastian looked at Abby and nodded. She was certain she understood his thoughts. She'd been kind to a man who had never shown her kindness, but she'd demonstrated how she wanted to be treated. As they left the church, he said, "I wanted to point to you when the pastor said we should treat others how we want to be treated because you already do that." Abby smiled, taking his arm. "Thank you for thinking that's how I am. You showed me kindness before I ever showed any to you." He thought about it for a moment. "I suppose that's true." He helped her into the wagon, and they waited there for the other couple. Abby knew it was going to be a good day. She couldn't wait until Anna and Stephen were back in the valley with them, but she'd cling to her husband and his wonderful family for now. She couldn't quite believe how fortunate she'd been to find someone who knew how to care for others. It didn't matter how her father felt about her or what she was leaving behind as she moved to this new community. She planned to be happy, and that was that.